Hello, this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith doing a video presentation for chesslessons.com. And in this short video, I will be showing you the rules of chess. So to start off with, we have an empty board. Let's first get used to the empty board. So you might notice that there are 8 by 8 vertical and horizontal lines here, making 64 squares on the board, and they're alternating dark and light colors. So the lines that are vertical, such as this one, we call files. The ones that are horizontal, such as this one, we call ranks. These are terminology that we use in chess. There are also, of course, diagonals, such as this or this. These are all one color, as you might notice. These things are important for understanding how the pieces move. You also might have noticed that there are these coordinates on the side of the board. The files are named A through H, and the ranks are 1 through 8. We'll be learning about the notation shortly. So to begin with, we'll start with a very simple piece, the rook. This is the piece that looks like a castle. It has little turrets on the top, and this piece moves in a very simple way. It can move forward and backward along the files, and side to side along the ranks. So it moves in a horizontal or vertical way, as far as the edge of the board or until some sort of obstacle, it meets some sort of obstacle. And this piece can move forward and back. It's important to realize. So for instance here, let's suppose we have this position. We have our own pawn here. The rook cannot jump over that pawn. It can't occupy the same square as the pawn either. It can move as far as this square, at which point it has to stop. It can't continue. It could also move other ways, of course. It could move here. It could move this way. The pawn has no bearing in its moves from side to side, and of course, as always, it can go back toward its side of the board. Now let's imagine that this same pawn was a black pawn. In this position, the rook can capture that pawn if it wants to. So it occupies the same square as the pawn, and the pawn disappears from the board, never to return in this game. Note that unlike some other games such as checkers, you do not have to capture. Captures are not obligatory. So for instance, in this position, the rook could also move here if the player of the white pieces chooses. Or the rook could move over here. Or the rook could move here. Or it could move here. So it's many different possibilities. This is how a piece is captured, though. Let's move on now. Next we have another fairly simple piece, the bishop. The bishop is the piece that's sort of pointy, usually has a cross on it. Looks a little bit similar to the pawn, which we just saw, which I put on the board as to show the capturing move, but it's bigger and a little bit more ornate. So that's the bishop. Now the bishop moves along the diagonals. So this bishop can move this way, for instance. It can also move back toward its side of the board. So bishops can also move forward and back, and of course on this diagonal as well. So this bishop can move to any of these squares. It can of course stop anywhere in between. Anywhere in between it can stop, or it can go to the very end square according to the player's choosing. This is the bishop. Now one thing to notice about the bishop is this bishop begin the game on a light square. It will never see a dark square. It will never move to a dark square or capture anything on a dark square. It exists entirely on the light squares. Another bishop on this square, for instance, will never see a light square. It will move always on the dark squares because this is the nature of the bishop. It moves along diagonals. It can only go on the dark squares. It can never move to a light square, no matter how many moves it makes. This is the bishop. It captures in the same way as a rook. Okay, also we have, for instance, pawns. Or we have, let's put our rook in the way. The bishop cannot jump over the rook, can't occupy the same square as the rook. It can only move as far as the square before the rook. Of course, it can move other places, but it cannot jump over the rook. It cannot go to this square in one move. That's impossible. So this bishop can move to these different squares. Now, if this was a black rook, the bishop could capture it. It takes the rook, and it remains there, and it's now black's turn. It can't continue moving until the next turn. This is how the bishop moves. So also I'll introduce where the pieces begin. We saw the rooks already. They begin in the corners. At the beginning of the game, they're in the corners. The bishops are in these squares. Well, you'll get used to it. You'll be able to learn how the pieces are set up fairly quickly. It takes a little practice, but you'll soon get it. So these are where these pieces begin. We'll get to some more next. So after the rook and the bishop, we will now move on to the queen. I go with the queen next because this is simply a combination of the moves of a rook and a bishop. So the queen can move like a rook, vertically and horizontally, just as a rook along the ranks and the files, or like a bishop along the diagonals. So the queen is an extremely powerful piece. In fact, it's the most powerful piece there is on the board. We'll get into the values of the pieces later, but you can see it covers much of the board. And notice, while it moves diagonally like a bishop, it can also cover both colors of squares. So for instance, in this position, diagonally the queen's only covering dark squares, but it can move via a file or a rank to a light square, let's say for instance here, and then on the next move, the queen will be able to move along diagonals of the light squares. And still, of course, all of these ranks as well and files. So this is the queen. And just like a knight and bishop, the queen, or a knight and a rook and bishop, the queen cannot jump over its own pieces. So let's put a bishop here, a rook here, and another bishop here. This queen now can only go here. It can only go as far as on the ranks these ways. Of course, it can still move on the ranks and files only those ways, but of course it can still move on all these diagonals. So its moves are somewhat limited by its own pieces blocking it. Now let's suppose that there's a black piece, for instance, a black rook right here. Now the queen can capture the rook. In one move, now it's black's turn. The queen can't continue moving. It doesn't jump over the rook. It captures it. It occupies the same square, and the rook disappears from the board. The queen doesn't have to capture the rook, however. You never have to capture something just because you can. There may be situations where there's no other choice but to capture something, but there's no rule in chess that you have to capture if you can. So the queen could move other places. It could move here. It could move here. It could move to many other squares. Notice that if the queen stays where it is, the black rook is also attacking the queen and could capture the queen if it were black's turn. So these two pieces are attacking each other. They're mutually attacking. This is the queen. Let's move on now. So we have also, next piece is a little tricky one. This is the knight. The knight is the one that looks like a horse. And it moves, the way it moves is often referred to as an L shape. Basically, it's moving up 2 squares and then over 1. So it moves like this. So essentially, in the shape of an L. This knight can also move to this square. And it can move to this square. And it can move to this square. And this square. And this square. And this square. And this square. The other thing about the knight that's unique compared to the other pieces is that it cannot stop in between, and it cannot go as far as it wants. It can only go to those specific squares. And it jumps over anything that might look like it's blocking the knight. So, let's now use these little circles here, which might make it a little bit easier, because the knight's actually not stopping anywhere in between. It has these 8 different possibilities where it can move to. It doesn't matter if there are a bunch of black pieces in between. It doesn't matter anything about any other pieces. It doesn't see them. It doesn't care about them. The knight still can go to all the same squares, jumping over these black pieces, and the black pieces remain on the board. let's suppose it's a black knight, it can still jump over all of its own pieces. Now, however, let's put these pieces on the squares where the destination squares for the knight. Like this, for instance. Now we're talking about this knight. This knight has no moves. Every single one of its destination squares is occupied by one of its own pieces. It cannot move to any of those squares. So this knight on the middle of the board has no moves. Now let's suppose it's a white knight, however. It can capture any of those pieces. So it can capture the queen. It could capture the knight. It could capture the rook. It could capture the other rook. It could capture any of those pieces, also the other ones that are remaining, and those pieces disappear from the board, and then it's black's turn. So this is the knight, and the knight is a little bit tricky, and I hope my explanation has been adequate, but basically you'll get used to how it moves. But it moves up 2, over 1, up 2, over 1, over 2, down 1. So 2 squares in any direction and then 1 square in the other. 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And these destination squares, sometimes referred to as the knight's star, because it kind of forms this ring or star around the knight. So if this is a little bit confusing at first, you'll get used to it, but let's move on for now. It's not an immediate thing, learning how to play chess. Next we have the pawns. The pawns are unique because unlike all of the other pieces, they can only move forward. So we're going to start off with how the knights are when the board is set up. They all start on each side's second rank. So for instance, white, all of the pawns begin the game on the second rank. For black, all of the pawns begin the game on the 7th rank, which is, from black's point of view, his second rank. So these are where the pawns are, and of course white is going this way, black is going this way. The pawns can only move forward, unlike the other pieces. They can move 1 square forward. Black can move 1 square forward. Each one moves 1 square forward. However, there's an exception. When the pawn is on the second rank, such as these pawns that are remaining on the second rank, or the 7th rank, that's for black's point of view, these pawns can still move twice. So this black can play, for instance, this move. White can play this move. Black can play this move. White can play this move. Black can play this move. And notice that white doesn't have to move. You don't have to move 2 squares. You can move 1 or 2. So for instance, white can go there. Black can go here, although this pawn could also go to this square. But suppose black goes here. Now this pawn, however, for instance, can only go 1 because it's already moved. This pawn here would be able to move 2, but it's blocked by white's pawn on the pawn here. So it can only move 1 square and stop. It can't go 2 because that square is occupied by the white pawn. It cannot capture the white pawn. Pawns capture differently, and we'll get back to that in a second. Now, for instance, this pawn can only move 1 square because it's already moved. This pawn could move 2 if it wishes, so black could go here. So now let's get to the question of how pawns capture. So unlike other pieces, pawns capture differently than how they move. So, for instance, this pawn cannot capture that pawn. Those 2 pawns are not attacking each other because they don't capture by going forward. They're actually stuck. They're blocking each other. These 2 pawns are blocking each other, as are these 2. They cannot capture each other and they cannot move forward. However, pawns capture diagonally. So, black has just moved the pawn here. White can now capture it by playing this move, capturing this way. Or, could capture this way as well. So this is how pawns capture. Do you see any other captures here possible? No, there are no other captures. Let's suppose now white takes this way. Okay, so he captures this pawn, and now black moves this pawn forward. Now white can capture that pawn, if he wants to. And black can capture back, because this is diagonal. He can capture this. Can white capture here? No. These 2 pawns are blocking each other. Both of them are immobile. This pawn is mobile, however. White can push the pawn up here. And now, if black wishes, he could capture it. That would be a good move, to just capture this pawn. However, let's suppose black doesn't do that, and instead pushes this pawn. Notice that actually black still has one pawn that can go 2 squares, this one. But we'll get back to that in a second. So let's suppose black pushes this pawn. Now white pushes forward, and let's say black does this. Now white can get the pawn to the other side of the board, and what happens when the pawn gets to the other side of the board is it turns into a new piece. This is called promotion, and this is of course usually a major goal. You really want to be able to promote your pawn because you gain a much more powerful piece. The pawns are the weakest pieces, but one of their biggest values is that when they get to the other side of the board, they turn into a new piece. So, for instance, you could make it a queen. That's usually what people do because the queen is so powerful. But you don't have to. There are some situations where you could make the pawn into a knight. Sometimes you want to do this because the knight attacks in a special way, different squares than the queen would attack. So, for instance, the knight is covering these squares. The queen wouldn't be covering those squares. So, occasionally that could be something you want to do. You could even turn it into a bishop. Oops. You could even turn the pawn into a bishop. So if we sorry about that. So if we push this pawn forward, it could turn into a bishop. Rarely do you want to do that. You could even turn it into a rook. It has to turn into something, though, when it gets to the edge of the board. Either a knight, a bishop, a rook, or usually a queen. We'll get to the king in a second. It can't turn into a king, and it cannot remain a pawn. So now one final rule, which is a rule that a lot of people learn later on, but I feel like I need to introduce it during the video because I want to cover everything. Now let's suppose it's black's move, and black plays this move, moving the pawn forward 2 squares. Because as we know, this pawn is still at home. It's still at its starting square. It doesn't matter how late in the game, the pawn can still move forward 2 squares. However, if we look where this pawn traveled, once again, it went here, and then it went here. It took 2 steps, all within the course of one move. So we have a special rule in chess called en passant, which means in passing in French. So that means as this pawn passed by white's pawn here, it stopped here for a second, and white could capture it. So in the course of a game, black moves here, and now it's white's turn, and they capture like this, capturing the pawn, and the black pawn just disappears from the board. This is the only situation where you can capture something, and the piece ends up on a different square than where the piece was captured. So the reason they developed this rule, just to explain it a little better, is that in the long distant past, pawns could only move 1 square at a time, even on their first move. So this pawn could only move to this square. It could not go 1 step further. But they decided to speed up the game a little bit. And one of the reforms they made in the late Middle Ages was to make it so the pawn could move 2 squares. But it didn't seem quite right that this pawn should be able to just pass by this guy here, which was covering that square. And it would have a big impact on how the game was played. So they decided to institute this rule en passant, which allowed the pawn to not just pass by its opponent without any consequences. Now, the thing is, after black plays this move, let's suppose white does something else. For instance, pushes this pawn here. Now it's black's move, and let's suppose black... now you might notice that black can also take en passant by doing this. That's also possible. So let's suppose... let's suppose black doesn't do that. Let's suppose black does this move. Now can white take this pawn still? No. The chance has been missed. So you can only capture en passant immediately. So only immediately after the opponent moves. So if they go g5, or they push this pawn here, if white wants to capture that pawn, they have to do it on the very next move. If they wait and do something else, then later in the game, black's pawn has reached g5 safely, and the en passant capture is no longer possible. So this is how the pawns move. Now finally, we'll get to the last and most important piece, not the strongest, but most important, which is the king. Now the king moves only one square in any direction. Very simple, one square in any direction. It can't go very far. It's a very slow-moving piece, although he has his value. When there's few pieces on the board, the king can be a fighting piece. But normally, you want to keep him safe, and the reason is because you lose the game whenever the king is trapped. That's called checkmate. So let's put the king, for instance, here, and then let's put a black rook here, and black. Always both players have a king. I've been showing without the king, of course, to make it simpler, but there's always two kings on the board. And let's suppose the black queen is there. Okay? Now the queen is attacking the king. This is called check, because if you notice, if it were black's move, the queen could capture the king. It's white's move here. So white has to answer this threat. You cannot allow your king to be captured. However, there's no escape, because if white king takes the queen, the black rook would take the king, and that's not possible. You cannot have your king taken, so that move is illegal. Oops. Sorry. So that's illegal. It's also impossible to go here because the queen would take the king. And once again, that's not possible. Can't go here because, as you know, the queen moves diagonally. You can't move here because, again, the queen moves diagonally. You can't move here because the queen or the rook could get the king there. So rather than having to move the king and fall on his sword, so to speak, the game is just over. The king is trapped, his capture is inevitable, and that's the end of the game. You don't actually capture the king, you just you trap the king, and he has to be in check as well, and unable to move anywhere. So this is called checkmate, and this is why the king is so important, because this is the goal, trying to checkmate your opponent's king. So you need to keep your king safe as much as possible. When there are lots of pieces on the board, the board is very dangerous for the king, so he should hide in the corner usually. Now let's talk again about check a little bit here. So we saw checkmate. Here's check. So for instance, it's black's move here, and black, let's say, plays this move. Now the queen has just moved there. It's white's turn. The queen is threatening to take the king. So the king has to escape from this. White cannot do something that doesn't involve the king escaping from check. So if white had, let's say, another piece somewhere, white could not move that piece because then the queen could get the king. That would be an illegal move. So white has to get out of check. And in this case, the only way to do it is to move the king somewhere. So since the queen covers this file, the white king has to move off that file. So he could move here. That would be a legal move, getting out of check. The king could move here. That's also a legal move. The king could go here as well, or here, or here, or here, in addition to the first two. Those are the legal ways for white to get out of check. So white has 6 possible moves in this position. Now this move would not be legal because the queen could still capture, and it's not allowed. Same with this move. The black queen could still capture. So check is when the king is threatened. Now you don't have to say check during the game. You can if you feel like it. At a beginner level, it might be helpful. Normally it's not done though. But when your player is in check, they have to get their king out of check. Now moving the king is not the only way out of check. In this position it is, but some positions there are other ways out of check. So let's add a bishop here. If it's white's turn, white can get out of check by moving the king, all the same moves as we just saw. This, 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 and this. But there's another way to get out of check. Do you see it? It's to capture the queen with the bishop. Remember, the bishop's moved diagonally. The queen gets captured. White has gotten out of check. So another way to get out of check is to capture the piece that's checking the king. Now, a third way to get out of check, again, the third way is not possible in this position, but if I add another piece right here, then it becomes possible. Do you see another way to get out of check besides the capture of the queen or the move of the white king? There's a way to get out of check by blocking. So we move the knight right here. It blocks the black queen's check, and thus white gets out of check. So you can put a piece in between, blocking. So this is the third way. 3 ways to get out of check. Now, another thing about this, about the king. Let's suppose we have this position, let's suppose we have this position. Black says, I want to trap the king to win the game. So black plays this move. This, however, is not a good move, because now white is not in check. The queen, of course, does not move like a knight. The knight would be checking the white king, but not the queen. So the king is not in check. However, the king has no moves. So the king cannot go here, because the queen would capture. The king cannot go here, because the queen would capture. The king cannot go here, because the queen would capture. So there's no moves for the white king, and of course it can't step off the side of the board. This is what's called stalemate, and this is a draw. The game ends, and the game is a tie. In chess we call a tie a draw. So that's stalemate, and basically black would not want to stalemate the white king in this position because black is up. Black is up a queen, so you don't want to draw. Black should instead trap the king and then use his king to come up and support then the queen to checkmate, which will happen eventually, pretty quickly. So this is stalemate. So now that we have seen how all the pieces move and basically covered the rules of their movement, we've got one more rule. But first I'm going to show you how the pieces, how the board is set up. So let's start off with the pawns, which, as you know, begin on the 2nd and 7th ranks. Or from black's point of view, it can also be seen as the 2nd rank for him. But the 7th rank on the algebraic board, you see the letter 7, the number 7. The pawns all stay on these, or begin on these ranks. So, and as you know, they both sides move forward. Just to review, this pawn, for instance, can go here, or it can go here. This pawn can go here, or it can go here. This pawn can go here, or it can go here, and so on. Black's pawns, meanwhile, also the same things, moving up the board toward the opponent. So these are the pawns. Now the rooks. The rooks begin in the corner. For both sides, the very corners. These are the rooks. Next to the rooks are the knights. The knights begin next to the rooks, in the square next to the corner. After that comes the bishop. The bishops are next to the knights. Notice that the bishops always are on different colors. Each side has a light and a dark squared bishop. As we saw early on, the light squared bishop will never see a dark square, and the dark squared bishop will never see a light square. If you see a board where a player has 2 bishops on the same color, then you know one of 2 things has happened. Either some illegal move was made, or you promoted a pawn, one of the players promoted a pawn to a bishop. That's the only way you can legally get 2 bishops of the same color, is if you promote a pawn onto the queening square, the promotion square, that's the same color as a bishop that you already have. Of course, this is extremely rare. These are the bishops. Now, next come the king and queen, and the important thing to remember is that the queen goes on her color. So the queen is the one with the spiky crown. The white queen goes on the white square. The black queen goes on the black color. And the remaining one is the king, which is on the opposite color of their, opposite square of their color. So the white king on the dark square, the dark square king on the light square. Also important to note, it's not an issue with a computer chess because the board is already set for you. But when you're playing a real-life chess, it's very important that the corner square be a white color, a light-colored square. So on the right corner. So, for instance, from white's point of view, the right-hand corner, H1, if you can see here, this should be a light square. From black's point of view, the corner from his right hand, white's left hand, of course, but from black's point of view, it's a right hand. This has to be a white square also. So this is important, or else things are very off. So this is the board. Now let's make a few moves, and I'm going to show you one other rule here of how the pieces move. Let's start with moving the knight out. Let's say white does this. The knights are the first pieces besides pawns which can move, because all the other pieces are blocked, but the knights can jump over their own pieces. Let's suppose black does this. Now white goes here, moving a pawn 1 square forward. Of course, it could also move 2 squares. But let's suppose it moves 1 square. And now black does this. Okay? And now white goes here, moving the bishop out. And let's suppose black goes here. Now we can make a special move that you can do only one time in a game, in each game. It's called castling. And the way you castle is you move the king 2 squares toward the rook, and then the rook jumps over the king and goes to the other side. So the way this looks, king goes to f1, g1, all in one move, and then this rook jumps over, also the same move. So this happens all in one move. So we have this position, it's white's turn, king goes here, rook goes here, now it's black's move. That's called castling, and you can only do it once in the game. And now black can do, let's say black can't castle here, because as you can see, you have to have the squares cleared. So if when we had this position and then the bishop hadn't moved yet, white couldn't castle yet. The squares between the king and the rook have to be clear. So black can't castle this way because the queen is in the way. Let's suppose white first castles. Let's suppose black now does this. And now white, let's suppose, does this. Now black can castle. You can castle on either side toward either rook. It's the same principle. What black's about to do is called castling queenside, because this is the side where the queen began on this side of the board. The left from white's point of view here, or the right from black's point of view. This is castling queenside, and the way you do it is you move 2 squares toward the rook, and the rook jumps over. Now notice it looks differently. White has only 1 square next to the king. Black has these 2. This is why black's castle here is called long castling. So this is castling long or castling queenside. Now let's suppose black didn't do that. Let's suppose black went here, white went here, black went here, white went here, black went here, white went here, and now black can castle kingside because he's cleared the way over there as well. So 2 squares, the rook jumps over. So this is castling. Now why do you castle? Well, the center of the board usually becomes a real battleground. You want to control the center. A lot of action happens in the center, and the center clears out. The pawns tend to get traded off. So for instance here, white might now strike in the center with this move, be a good move. But the center basically tends to get cleared out, opened up. That would leave your king vulnerable. That's why you castle. That's one of the reasons you castle. The other reason is, if we look at this position, the rooks are kind of trapped in the corner and the king's in the way. Once you castle, the rook is now free to move toward the center of the board and do things, and now they're connected. They can work together. So these are the 2 main reasons why you castle. Now let's see some of there's various other rules about castling. Let's suppose in this position here, black went here for some reason. He moved the rook. And then white did this, and now he moved the rook back. Okay, it's nonsensical, but let's suppose black did it. Then white does this. Now black can no longer castle on the king side. It's illegal to do that. You can't castle when you've moved a rook on that side. Black can still castle on the queen side, though. He didn't move that rook. So if you look at this position, it looks like black can castle, but that's why it's important to know what happened before in certain cases, whether castling is possible. This is one of the situations where you need to, in order to tell if a move is legal, you need to know what came before. So the fact that black moved his rook here and then back earlier in the game, it's not visible on the board, but nevertheless it prevents him from castling kingside. Same thing if black would have moved this rook back and forth. Then he wouldn't be able to castle queenside, but he could still castle kingside. Now finally, if black moved the king here, let's suppose, white did this, the king moved back, white did this. Now black can't castle at all. You cannot castle after you've already moved your king. This is not allowed. So if you've moved your king ever in the game, you cannot castle in that game. So that's an important rule, which is why you should generally try to avoid moving your king early on. Let's go back and start over anew. And so I want to show a couple more rules about castling, because there's a few other things that tell you when you can castle and when you can't. So let's suppose we can begin with this move. Black goes here. Let's suppose white goes here. Black goes here. White goes here. Black goes here. White goes here. Black goes there. White goes here. And now suddenly black decides he wants to castle. So he castles kingside. That move is illegal. The reason is because this bishop covers the square that the king has to move through. So you're not allowed to castle through check. The king cannot go to this through check, so black cannot castle kingside here. Not in this position, maybe later on if he drives this bishop away. Let's suppose black does this, and the bishop decides to retreat, and then black can castle. So it's not preventing it permanently, like with a king move. If black had moved his king, you would never be able to castle according to the rules. But it does prevent it from happening at that moment if the king would have to move through check. Another rule, once again, let's go back. This one's a little bit more obvious. Let's suppose we have these moves played. And black does this, not a very good move, but let's continue. Now here white decides to castle. Perfectly legal, you can do it. Black does this, white goes here, and then black decides to castle, kingside. This move is not legal because he's moving into check, and we know that you can never move into check. So this would allow white to capture the king, but it doesn't happen. It's simply a legal move, and so generally the move would have to be taken back. So this is another rule about castling. Another thing. Let's suppose this position. Let's suppose black plays this move, and white goes. Let's suppose black plays this move, and white plays this move, and then black goes here, and white goes here, and black pushes this pawn, and then we retreat the bishop, and then black goes here, and now white checks. Okay. So now suddenly black decides he wants to castle, and he castles. This move is also illegal. You cannot castle out of check. So even though this move would get the black king out of check according to the rules, there's a rule that you simply cannot castle when you're in check. So you cannot castle. If you're in check, you can't castle, but you can get out of check and then maybe later castle. So for instance here, if black wants to castle in the future, one thing he could do is block the check by moving the knight here. Now whatever white does, makes some move, now black can castle legally. He's not in check anymore, so he can castle. However, if, let's suppose, in this position, black didn't block the check with a knight and instead moved the king, now he'll never be able to castle again, because as we know, you cannot castle if you've moved your king. So the important thing with castling, you cannot castle out of check, through check, or into check. You cannot castle if you've moved your king, or if you've moved the rook on the side you intend to castle. So these are the rules of castling. So now let's get to, now that we've learned how all the pieces move, let's get to some questions about other aspects of chess. So we've learned how the game ends in a victory for one side by checkmate. This is how the game ends if one side wins. Also, it's possible for someone to resign. So, for instance, we have position, let's say, where white has a giant advantage in material, and it's clear that white will soon win. Sometimes people give up. This is also a way to win a game of chess. There's a third way to win a game of chess, which is when the clock, people using a clock to play, when you run out of time, you can lose a game that way. Now, draw, or a tie, in chess it's known as a draw, this can be arrived at many different ways. So, for instance, if we have this position, and let's suppose black makes this move, and white now captures the rook. This is a draw. There's king against king. There's no way to win the game. This is a draw. So you don't continue playing because you can't checkmate. Let's also suppose white has a bishop, and now black plays this move. Let's suppose black plays this move, white takes it. The game is also a draw, because king and bishop cannot checkmate a king. There is no way to do it, so the game is a draw. The same thing if white had a knight here. This position is also automatically drawn. There's no more moves played, the game ends if you reach this position. If, however, there's a pawn, of course the game continues, because white can absolutely win this position. We just have to make this pawn into a new queen. Start by pushing it and slowly push it up the board and make a new queen. So if there's a pawn on the board, the game is not drawn by lack of material. So this is draw by lack of material. We already saw the stalemate. So for instance, such a position as this, black is not in check, but his king has no moves. The knights cover all of the squares, and it's black's turn. That's a draw, stalemate. So if you have no moves and you're not in check, it's a draw. Of course, if black had a pawn, here, it wouldn't be stalemate. He can move the pawn, so the game continues. Another way the game can be drawn is if, let's say we have a position and the players move 50 moves with no pawn being moved and no piece being captured. Basically, it's a type of position. Usually there's no pawns left on the board, or it might be a very blocked position, but one side is trying to win but not making any progress, or nobody's making any progress, basically. So people who made rules of chess in official tournaments made 50 moves that you can play, but if you make 50 moves with no pawn being from either side, no pawn being moved, and no piece being captured, then the game is drawn. Of course, if either side at any point moves a pawn before the 50 moves, then the count starts over. Or if a piece is captured within the 50 moves, then the count starts over. So this is a fairly rare, but sometimes happens when there's usually some situation like this, or where there's only where there's no pawns left. Another way a game can be drawn is let's take, for example, this position. Let's make a position here. Let's make some position, and we have like this, let's say, for instance. Oops. And black has basically yeah. So essentially, like this kind of position. Now black has a big advantage. You can see that that black has 2 rooks, and he's up with 2 rooks and a knight. However, it's white's turn here. Okay, white's not in check. We don't want this rook to be checking the king, because otherwise white would obviously lose. So it's white's turn. White can do what he wants. Down a lot of material. We call the pieces material. But white has a chance here. White plays this good move. Check to the king. Black has only one way out of check. Black goes here. Now white checks again. Black king goes here. Only move. No way to block, no way to take the queen. White goes back. Black only has this move. White goes here. Black goes there. This is called perpetual check. So this means the check goes on and on forever. Now white doesn't have to keep checking, of course. White could play some other move, but that would be a terrible decision, because black would win with the extra material. In fact, most moves would allow black to checkmate by taking this pawn here. So basically, the players are just going to repeat forever. But naturally, we don't want to force people to sit at the board and repeat moves forever. So the rule is 3-time repetition. So if we have this position where we started, and white goes here, 1 time we've reached this position. Black goes here, 1 time we reach that position. Black goes there, 2 times we reach, actually this is 1 time we've reached this position, 2 times we've reached this position, 2 times we reach this position, and then 3 times we reach this position. And now the game is drawn. And so both players have to have their pieces all in the same squares, exactly the same squares. So it's not like one player can just move back and forth and claim a draw. Both players have to be doing the same things and reach the same position 3 times in the same game. So we could even have many moves in between. Sometimes it happens But basically this is, and it doesn't have to be check, it could be pieces moving back and forth, but 3-time repetition is a draw. So this is another rule for draw. Now let's see what else. Another rule of draw. So we have the 50 move rule. We have the stalemate. We have a 3-time repetition, which may be perpetual check or something similar to it. We have a lack of material. And then we have a situation where the players just agree to a draw, and this can happen. So if we take this position, for instance, each side has a pawn and a rook. So the position is very equal, and unless someone made a really big mistake, it would just go on and on and on, and eventually the 50 move rule, or somehow the rooks would get traded, and then the pawns, and then it would be king against king. But the game would just go on and on with nobody having a chance to win. So usually people would agree to a draw at some point in the near future, because there's no sense in playing on in such a position forever. Now, if you want to, you can. If either player wanted to and hoped that maybe the opponent would make a terrible mistake, like if black were to play this move, then white would take the rook and certainly win. But really the only way to lose such a position is just to drop the rook, as long as the king stays around the pawn. So it's a very drawish position, so sometimes people agree to draws, and this is within the rules of chess. So I think I've covered all the rules about the result. Another rule is, and it's not really relevant with computers, but in real life, if you touch a piece, you have to move it. And if you let go of that piece, then that's your move. You can't take it back. This is obvious, but an important thing. If you touch a piece, you have to move it. And sometimes in casual games, people kind of don't always follow these rules, but it's best to get in the habit of doing it, because in serious tournaments, you have to move the piece that you touch. So now, as one last thing, I will cover the coordinates. So as we saw, or the notation. So as we saw, and this is going to be really fast because it would be hard to do it without writing things down, which I can't really do on this board here. But basically, we have our squares, and we can point to any square using the coordinates. So for instance, this square is A1. We see A right here and 1 here. So we have this, and then this. So that's that square. Or let's say this square. This is D4. We have D, and we have 4. This square here, G7. This square, H1. This square, C6. So this is how we name a square. So now let's just set up the board quickly here. But basically, knowing that we can name any square, and we always put the letter first. It's just the standard. It's just the tradition. It's always the number first. But since we can refer to any square, that means we can always say where a piece moves. And there's only a few other things that we need to know about that, but otherwise notation is fairly simple. So for instance, we have this position. We have white goes here. This is pawn to e4. We see e4 here. The pawn moved there. Now, when you write it down, it's the tradition that you don't even write pawn, because there are many pawns, and so you just write e4. You don't need to put p. You can, but normally in this system of notation, algebraic notation, you don't need to say p for pawn, because all the other pieces are named. So just e4. Black could make this move, e5. This is black's move. Now this move, for instance, would be knight to f3, and we write it in f3 because k is already being used by the king. So knight to f3 is n f3, even though knight starts with a k. This would be n c6. The knight moves to c6. And notice that we don't have to say where it came from. You can, that's long algebraic, but you don't have to. The only time you have to say where a piece came from is if two of the same kind of pieces can move to the same square. So knight to c6. Now let's suppose white plays this move, c3. This is pawn to c3, but we just write c3. And then black can play this move. This is knight e7. However, You don't just write in e7, because then we don't know which knight, because they both can move to e7. So the way we say this is in g to e7, because this knight is on the g file. So it can move to e7 from the g file, so it's in g to e7. Let's imagine now, okay, we'll set up this position, okay, and black plays this move. Now, clearly both knights can move to e7. However, in c to e7 also doesn't cut it because they're both on the c file. So if they're both on the same file, then we have to use a rank. So this is in 8 to e7, the letter 8, or the number 8. And this is in 6 e7, the number 6. So if the rank isn't sufficient, then the file is what we use next. So let's suppose black plays this move. In g e7, white plays this move, d4. Pawn to d4, but we just say d4. Now black decides to take. So he plays e takes d4. The way we write it is we write the file where the pawn came from, e, and then x, because capture is x, and then d4, where it ended up. So it's also possible to just write ed. Some people do that. The pawn from e captures the d file, because normally there's not very many situations where that would refer to two possible different moves. But e takes d4 makes it absolutely clear, because the reason we need to say where it came from is because many situations we could have a situation like this where two pawns could capture the same thing. So e takes d4 is this one, ex d4, and this is cx d4. Okay, so going back now, ex d4, let's suppose white recaptures with the knight. This would be nx d4. If white captures with the pawn, this would be cx d4, because the pawn is, we say c for the pawn because it's the c pawn on the c file, x d4. Okay. Now let's suppose black plays this move. This is d5. We don't say p, we just say where the square that it moves to. Now let's suppose white goes here. This is bishop b5, or b5. And notice another thing, that the pieces should be capital letters and the squares are lowercase. You can see here they're all lowercase on the board. Then when you write squares in the notation referring to a square, it's always lowercase. For a piece, it's always uppercase. That way we don't confuse bishop with the b pawn, for instance, or bishop with the square b5 or something like that. So b, capital B, b5, lowercase is the second b. Now let's suppose black plays this move. Okay, I'm making some nonsensical moves, but let's suppose black plays this move. Now white castles. So the way we write castling, of course, we move two squares toward the rook, and the rook jumps over, all one move. The way we write this is by writing the number 0 dash 0. Or it could be O-0, O-O, I'm not sure which one, but in any case, 0-0 I think is usually written with a 0. But this is castling. Now if you were to castle queenside, it's 0-0-0. So that denotes long castling, because you could have situations where both castles are possible. Let's suppose like this, and white decides to castle queenside. This is 0-0-0. And this is just 0-0. So these are basically a quick introduction to notation. We have a few more things. Let's go back to where we were, to this position, and let's suppose white castles, as we said. Black plays this, and now white decides to take the knight. This is check to the king. Okay, because the bishop can take the king. It's check. So the way we write check, we write this b x c6. This is the c6 square. The bishop took on c6, and then we write a little plus after it, which means check. So b x c6 plus, which means check. It's just useful to write check. That's usually what's done. Checkmate is written by two pluses, or sometimes by a number sign. And so I think we've pretty much covered it. En passant move, let's say for instance white instead played this and black played this move. Now we take en passant, we write E, we go here, EX F6. So you write the square that it ends up on. So I think I've covered everything of the basic rules of chess. Of course, there's other things dealing with the clock and many other rules related to chess, but these are what you really need to know in order to play a game of chess. I hope you found this informative. This has been Grandmaster Bryan Smith.